Somebody else.
Well, I do too because I had kids, but.
So with so many of you here tonight, you guys intimidate me, so I'm a little nervous. But a couple things though before we get started. Note that we started a little late, right? It's after 7, so if you're here a little late, it's Vicky's fault. If I go over. But I know some of you have overlapped in other sessions. We wanted to point out that we do have alumni here tonight, which are the Lunas. They were here in the last session, and now they're here back to join us for our last session. So it's good to see them, but what I wanted to let them know is what's different from the last time we were here is that Anna's put the time in to do a PowerPoint presentation, which we didn't have when they came through the last time. And if nothing else, it just gives you something to stare at instead of making your Meyer order. But just that's one thing that's. So anyways, I want to point that out that's different. One thing that is exactly the same that you guys will notice, and that's the class participation at the end. Exactly like when you guys are here. Nothing. Right, yeah, it continues, the tradition. So, and I do want to thank everybody for coming out, not only this night, but all the time you guys have put in, your dedication to coming back for so many weeks. I remember when we started, it was nice outside when we started last fall, so appreciate everybody investing the time to come out. We sure enjoy it. We like sharing with you guys, and hopefully Vicki invites us back to do this again for another group, or you're all invited to come. As you can see, there are a lot of people that come more than once. So tonight though, we wrap up with Jesus as first we go through Jesus as the promised bridegroom that was coming, and then we'll look at the sacrament of marriage. But since this is our last time together, what I want to do is go back only for a little while. We want to go back from our time that we spent together, and I want to cherry pick or hit the highlights of our time together, though, that point us toward the points that help make the point that we make tonight. So from that first night when we introduced it, we said, hey, with the Omega Project, big umbrella, what we want to try to do is answer 3 questions. How do we get here? Hopefully we did that the first couple nights. Why does God allow bad things to happen? Hopefully through looking at that story of salvation history and Israelites history, you start to wonder, is it really God that makes bad things happen, or is it just maybe our own disobedience? And sometimes God does allow good things or bad things to happen, but it's meant for the better. So hopefully you got to see that as we went again through that story of salvation history. And then the third is just, is there any hope? And that's what we want to wrap up tonight with, was answering that question. So we have one thing that you have to do tonight. When I get all done, I'm going to forget to answer, is there any hope? So you guys just don't let me leave without answering that question, is there any hope moving us forward? But then specifically what we said is, as we go through the story of salvation history, we're going to look at it under this focused lens of, one, we're going to follow the story of God's covenant that he made with his people, which God had established right from the beginning. Made a covenant makes a family bond. The oath of that original covenant is the same it is today. I'll be your God, you'll be my people. There's this oneness about it. We looked at the growth of God's family through the covenant, right? Starting with Adam and Eve, the one holy couple, to one holy family, to the one holy tribe, and then ultimately in the fulfillment that Jesus brought with the renewal of the covenant, the new and everlasting covenant, this worldwide blessing. As we looked at the covenant, we also talked about there was always a sign from the beginning, the sign that God made with creation. The way that we recall of the sign is the Sabbath. Noah emerges from the ark. That sign was the rainbow. And then there was typically a way to renew the rules of the covenant, or the oaths that were made back with Moses. It was participating in the Passover. And now what we looked at in the last couple weeks is that renewal of that new and everlasting covenant. The way we do that is participation in the Eucharist. So we looked at that story through the evolution of, or the revealing of God's covenant with his people. We also looked at that. We also asked the question of, can you trust God through Israel's history of them being close to God, falling away from God, falling into sin, They found themselves in slavery, supplication to God, then salvation, and God would come and send them a Redeemer, and the cycle continued over and over as we went through that story. We said we're going to view the story through the lens of typology. I know you all know that definition by now, but it's that connection between the old and the new, where the old covenant is revealed in the new, and the new covenant is hidden in the old. When you see that story that way, it really brings life to it, brings color to that story. We also said as we go through it, we'll go through it in a chronological order, and hopefully when you see the story of the chronological order of the salvation history of God's story himself, then we see how it makes sense to where we participate in that story of salvation history through the sacraments. So hopefully that's what we said the first night. Hopefully we're successful in following those 3 or 4 bullet points in our story our journey through the story. Let me go back to the very first night though, and again, I'm not going to do all of it. What I want to do is just cherry pick what it was the important points of that very first night that we were together. But we said we're going to go into chronological order. The most logical place to start is in the beginning, so that's where we started, was in the beginning, story of Genesis. Looked at the story of creation. God created all things out of nothing. His spoken word, all things were created. He separates the light from the dark. There was that specific counting that we looked at that led up to the 7th day. But we said what was important about 7, not that God specifically created in 7 consecutive working days. What was more important is the Hebrew term or definition for 7 is Shabbat, which means to swear an oath or to covenant oneself. So from the beginning, God had this covenant in mind with his people, with his entire creation at the dawn of time. We see that Adam is created out of the dust of the ground. Adam's first breath was God's breath, so Adam had God's divinity within him. He makes all the animals, the other creatures. He gives Adam dominion over all the animals, brings them all to Adam. Adam is to name them, which gives him that authority over the animals. Adam's living in God's garden with him, dining in his presence. All was good until God said, it isn't good that man should be alone. That's when he puts Adam into the deep sleep out of his side. You guys know the story. Out of his side, Eve is created. When Adam comes out of his deep sleep, God escorts woman to Adam, and that's when Adam exclaims, finally bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. And that's where we hear that the two then became one flesh. That first night we said, all right, so here's the identification of that human relationship of marriage between one man and one woman. When Adam first sees Eve, right, in his ecstasy, right, he finally says, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. Finally, my body makes sense. The two of them participated in that one flesh union. It was a liturgical, them participated in that union was a liturgical type of thanksgiving to God for being part of his creation and for giving humanity part of his power of creation, right? God spoke and all things were created. But his creation continues on even to this day where human beings are created all the time through that one flesh union. Husband and wife love each other, and sometimes 9 months later we got to give that love a new name. So here, we're only in the 2nd chapter of Genesis. Marriage is identified, and we said that night that there must be something special about marriage, that it only took a couple of pages, and marriage is identified. End of chapter 2 states that Adam and Eve were naked, but they felt no shame. They had this perfect relationship between the two of them. Sin hadn't entered the story yet, so the relationship between the two of them was perfect, and their relationship with God was perfect. Living in God's agape love and his perfect grace. His will was their will, so everything was all good. When Adam was created, though, he was told to till and to keep the garden. And one of the definitions for keep is to protect it. So God knew from the very beginning that the garden needed to be protected against something, and we see it in chapter 3 when the serpent enters the story. Adam and Eve are at the tree. Remember, we talked about this 100 times. The story, central drama of the story is this story of 2 trees. The tree of knowledge and the tree of life. Adam and Eve went to that tree of knowledge. The serpent starts talking to Eve, telling her the 2 big lies. Remember these 2 big lies for later on. The 2 lies that he told Eve was Well, first he just starts with, putting some doubt into her mind. Did God really say? He really doesn't mean it. But the two lies were, when you eat of the fruit, surely you will not die. And God doesn't want you to eat it because he knows that when you do eat the fruit, you will be just like him. So those two lies are, you won't die and you can be just like him. The way that God made male and female, he made them in his image and likeness, so there was no more being like God. So the two lies that Satan had told Eve. Adam doesn't perform what God had told him was to protect it. As the serpent is talking to Eve, he doesn't step in and defend his wife. The two of them eat from the tree, and that brings about the original sin and we talked about all the curses that came to Adam. No longer will the earth just give up its food. You're going to have to work for your food. You're going to toil in your sweat. We talked all about that. But probably the worst of the curses is when Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden and the gates are locked. So now they've lost their access to God, to his divinity. That relationship that they had that was so perfect with him has now been disrupted. But those gates were locked to protect the way to the tree of life. What we said is, boy, it's only been 3 chapters. We're not very far into this Bible, and this is all sad news. The frowny face. We said, well, let's see what John says. John's Gospel opens up within the beginning, talking about the light couldn't overcome, or the dark couldn't overcome the light. A specific counting, and the next day, and the next day. Finally, the opening of chapter 2 is the wedding feast at Canaan. So it was not only the 3rd day, but it's the 7th day, and by no coincidence, where you find yourself but a wedding. So similar to the original story of creation, with the 7th day being a wedding ceremony or a marriage type ceremony, here it is in John's, where John's Gospel, remember a couple things about John's Gospel. John doesn't have any miracles in his Gospel. He refers to them as signs, because what signs do is point us to something pointing beyond themselves. And the way that John's Gospel finishes is, boy, I've got so much more that I could tell you, but if I wrote down everything that Jesus did and said, the entire world couldn't contain all of the books. So just keep that in mind. So John had to shorten up the story a little bit and just leave us breadcrumbs to follow to get to the point of what either he was trying to get us to understand or what Jesus ultimately wants us to understand. So we're at the wedding feast. We meet Jesus and Mary. Mary, the new Eve. Jesus goes to, now going forward in the story, goes through his passion, death, and resurrection, takes on those curses of Adam, goes to the abode of the dead, gathers up all of those souls who had been locked out of heaven, and as Jesus went to that tree of life, and in his perfect obedience, was able then to open up the gates to heaven. Our access to the garden is restored. Our access to God is restored. So where now we have the ability to spend eternity with him. So we're like, all right, happy face. So that is the central drama to the story. But marriage being so important, what we said that first week is Genesis 2. We already hear that line of, therefore a man leaves his wife and his father and mother and cleaves to his wife, and they become one flesh. So we hear about that one flesh union as it relates to our earthly relationships between a man and a woman. The book of Revelation ends with John's revelation, right? Seeing what's going on in heaven, and that's when the angel said, write this: blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. So what we've unpacked the last couple weeks is how do we participate in that supper of the Lamb, that feast, that meal that Jesus is inviting us to, the Eucharist. But how do we participate in this marital type relationship, where this relationship isn't between a man and a woman, right? It's between the Lamb, Jesus, and us. And how do we participate in that one flesh union? And that's what we're here to try to wrap up this evening. So let me just go really quick through our history of salvation history. A lot of slides, and again, all I want to do is highlight what is important or points us forward to tonight's presentation. So we started with the story with Noah. What was probably most important here is that it was Noah's offspring, what Ham had done. right? Yes. What Ham had done, cursed be Canaan, his son, from his wickedness. And what we started to see was that as humanity starts to populate the face of the earth, there was a wicked line and a righteous line. And what God had told his people at that time is, I place in front of you good and evil, and to choose good. We looked at the story of Abraham being called out of Babylon, and then his obedience to God went on that journey that God took him on. Through his obedience, God made a covenant with Abraham and made him those 3 promises that everybody knows of: land, royal dynasty, and then a worldwide blessing. We've done this a whole lot of the testing of Abraham and the sacrifice of Isaac. What I want to stop though at is, and just to remind you, when it was time for Isaac to have a wife, Abraham told his servant, at the time he was living in the land of Canaan, to get a wife for Isaac, he told his servant, go back to my homeland, don't take a wife from amongst the Canaanites, that line from, remember, from Noah, that wicked line, don't find him a wife from amongst the Canaanites, but go back to my homeland. The servant was anxious, can't let my master down, made the deal with God, found himself at a well, and said, I'll know that I found the one when I go to the well. If I ask the woman that I approach, if I say, give me a drink, if she replies with, not only will I give you a drink, but I'll also water your flock, I'll know that she's the one. Almost no more did he think that, and all of a sudden here Rebecca comes, and he says those words, give me a drink. She says, not just you, but your flock. So he knew that God had delivered the appropriate wife for Isaac and Rebecca. One thing to keep in mind is that right away what he did, if you remember the detail, is what the servant did was put rings on her fingers and earrings in her ears and decked her out and gave her this this gift, because there was a tradition in antiquity that the groom would give his bride, offer her a gift. So as we go through the story now from Isaac, next is Jacob. If you remember Jacob, when he dupes Esau, he's got to hightail it out of town, and in his journey he finds himself at a well. So here, when you find somebody who's at a well and he meets a woman, remember we talked about this 6 months ago, our ears should perk up, because what's going to happen? Right, our engagement proposal. So sure enough he does. He asks for Rachel, or he sees Rachel. He asks Laban for her hand. He says, yep, you need to work for her for 7 years. He gladly does. But then he puts Leah in the tent, you know, that duping then of Jacob. But then Jacob then does agree, though, to work 7 more years for Leah. Or not Leah. He was married to Leah first. 7 more years. And Laban then allowed him to marry Rachel. And then that story between the 3 of them, plus their concubines, all stand at the head of what ultimately became their 12 sons, or the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph's the favored son, takes the people down into Egypt. And this is just the point, the major point here is that you guys know all the story and the travels and the tribulation of Joseph being thrown into prison, and then his brothers finally having to come when the food ran low. But it was the end of that story. What Joseph says is, what you had intended for evil, God used for good. Because by bringing the people down into Egypt, right, it spared the Israelites from the famine that was happening in Canaan, in their time living in Egypt. So that was a good thing. But then they lived for 400 years amongst the Egyptians. They become enslaved. They cry out. Moses is sent. The important parts are to do with Moses, one of the greatest prophets. But the 2 signs, the 2 bookend signs that Moses performs, is the first one is turning the water of the Nile into blood, and then the last of the plagues, right? The 10th plague is that Passover meal, or the sacrificing of the lamb, that you need to do to spare the life of your firstborn. If you didn't eat of the flesh of the lamb, then you would lose your firstborn. So it happens to all of the Egyptians, and that's when Pharaoh comes and tells the people that it's time for them to leave Egypt. So Moses delivers people out of Egypt. We looked at the desert wanderings. I think we spent enough of this time looking at the rules of Passover. and then the people living in the desert in their times of disbelief or grumbling. They were hungry. Bread came out of the sky. They were thirsty. Water came out of the rock. It was God that was with them all the time, protecting his people as they were traveling toward the promised land. When we got to the promised land, it was Joshua that led them into the promised land. If you remember, Joshua was the first of the judges, an upright judge, reverent to God or obedient to God. And it was through his obedience that allowed the people, the Israelites, to be successful in battle. After Joshua, though, came a line of some judges that weren't so good, as they were trying to take over the land. The people were upset with the judges. That's when they asked for a king. You know those stories where they're given a king. By the time that Solomon had passed, we get into this line of really bad kings that had turned the people's hearts away from God. With Solomon was that civil war, 10 tribes to the north, Israel, versus the 2 tribes of the south were Judah. So that split of the 12 tribes, both with kings that led the people away from God. If you remember the one, we specifically looked at the story of King Ahab, who was married to Jezebel. Jezebel was into Baal worship, and the Baal that she worshipped was Beelzebub. So she worshipped Beelzebub, so she was a devil worshiper. And here the king of Israel is supposed to be leading his people back toward God, had this influence of false gods, or turning the people's hearts away from God. As the people are turning their hearts away from God and into all these false gods, the prophets start to emerge, telling the people before exile, repent, turn your way back to God. While they're in exile, there was a point, though, too, of God has something that you want to. You've turned your back on God, but while you're in exile, there's something that you need to learn, that you followed these false gods into exile, and while you're there, you're going to find out that it was all empty promises. That you were better off when you were with me, your original God, your original maker, and more than that, your original husband. And what we talked about when we were about to spot is, here comes all that marital language with God promising himself that the people would be saved, and at one point he would betroth the people to himself. So through the prophets, though, here come a lot of that language. Isaiah telling the people how the faithful city has become a whore. She that was full of justice, righteous, lies into her, but now murders. Jeremiah, can a girl forget her ornament, or bride her attire? Yet my people have forgotten me days without number. Instead of as a faithless wife leaves her husband, so you have been faithful to me, O house of Israel, says the Lord. So all of these analogies to, you've turned your back on me, meaning God, who's always intended from the beginning to have this marital type relationship with you, as intimate as a husband and wife. A covenant. I'll be your God, you'll be my people. So a single bride to a single groom. Finally, in Isaiah, though, comes right out and says, for your maker is your husband, the Lord of hosts is his name, the Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. So what the people would have known at this time is that the promised Messiah, the promised Redeemer, when he comes, he will fulfill that promise as the bridegroom. So the people are anticipating that until Jesus comes. So now what we want to do is look at, how did Jesus identify himself as the bridegroom? And Ann's going to read that now in John 3. And while she's looking for it, though, let me just remind everybody how John's Gospel starts. Chapter 2 is at the wedding feast of Canaan. Ann's going to read John 3 right now to hear what John the Baptist has to say about Jesus and who he is. And then all of a sudden, in chapter 4, you find yourself with that story of the woman at the well. So John even uses that imagery of marriage in the beginning of his gospel.
Good.
Yep.
You yourselves bear me witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him. He who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom, who stands and hears him, rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. Therefore this joy of mine is now full. He must increase, but I must decrease.
So the people were asking John, who's this new guy? They're asking, who are you? And he says, I'm not the Messiah, but I've been sent ahead of him to prepare you for the coming of the Messiah. He who has the bride is the bridegroom, the friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly. So what John has identified himself as the best man or the bridegroom, or not the bridegroom, he's the best man. The role of the best man in antiquity would have been that it was the best man's responsibility to get the location for the marriage celebration prepared. So he's preparing for the coming of the groom. I think we're going to read it again in a couple slides, but remember, I think we talked last week or 2 weeks ago, Jesus is getting his disciples prepared for his death, and he starts using marital terms when he says, I'm going somewhere that you guys can't go. They say, where are you going? Because we'll go anywhere that you're going to go. And he says, no, I'm going to go to my Father's house, but I will come back and get you. So he's going somewhere. There's a promise of a return. When he promises to return, that's when his disciples say, well, when are you coming back? And he says, only my Father knows. So the groom in antiquity, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but in antiquity, the groom's father gave the groom permission to go and to claim his wife. And so what the best man has no idea when the groom is coming. He's just preparing the place for the 7-day party that's taking place. So he doesn't know. He's getting everything ready, not knowing. When he finally hears the voice of the groom, that's when he celebrates, because now here comes the groom and it's going to be a 7-day party. So after saying all that, what John has identified himself as the best man, and he says, the friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. For this reason my joy has been fulfilled. So what he says is, I'm the part of the best man preparing the way. He's been baptizing people, preaching a challenge of repentance. He's preparing the people for the coming of the bridegroom of Jesus. He's been on center stage. But he says, now that I've heard the voice of the groom, and I'm greatly excited, because here comes the wedding feast. Therefore, John no longer takes center stage. It's Jesus that takes center stage, and that's why John says, I must decrease while he increases. So John the Baptist identifies Jesus as this long-awaited bridegroom. Now I was going to read a little bit of the story from the wedding feast at Cana.
On the third day, there was a marriage at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the marriage with his disciples. And when the wine failed, the mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. And Jesus said to her, O woman, what have you to do with me? My hour has not yet come. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Now 6 stone jars were standing there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. And Jesus said to them, fill the jars with water. And they filled them up to the brim.
Okay, that's enough.
Okay.
So they've run out. So they're supposed to have this 7-day feast. At some point during the 7 days, they run out. Mary, feeling sympathy for the wedding party, though, she goes to Jesus, tells him he's out of wine, and his response is, my hour has not yet come. And what we talked about with John being the book of signs, and signs pointing them to something else, by Jesus saying that my hour has not yet come, he's saying, indicating that there will be an hour. Where Mary asked him to help with the wine, he says, my hour hasn't come, indicating that there is an hour when he'll give this wine, this messianic wine, one time in the future. And what we talked about was his hour that he refers to. Most theologians would agree that his hour refers to his passion, death, and resurrection. Let me go just a quick, remember Moses? Moses' first sign was water and the blood. His last was the Passover lamb, or the slaughtering of the lamb. There was this promise right before Moses was telling everybody that there's a prophet greater than me that's coming. So Jesus, to show that here even the new Moses is on deck, is what does he do? He has the bookend stories from John's gospel that starts with the wedding feast at Cana, where Jesus does turn the water into wine. And then the other end is another marriage story, and that's his passion, death, and resurrection. And we'll get there for a second to show you how during Jesus' death is a wedding proposal and a wedding consummation. But the question though here is, how did Jesus, what we're doing is showing how did Jesus show that he's the bridegroom. We probably have to go back I don't know, 30 years, time's flying, so maybe it's even 40 years with weddings. Weddings now, the things are probably more between the families, probably everything has to be even. But 40 years ago, what was not the only, but what was the basic requirement of the groom's family, or what did the groom have to provide for the wedding? The booze, right? The wedding. So by Mary asking Jesus, not going to the groom of you have a problem with the wine, she takes Jesus out to center stage and says, you provide the wine, show everybody that you are this, the bridegroom Messiah that is promised to come. So now in chapter 4, I know we've read it 100 times, but for the last time, Aaron's going to read a little bit of that dialogue between Jesus and the woman at the well.
Starting in 7.
Yep.
There came a woman of Samaria to draw water, and Jesus said to her, give me a drink. For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, how is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews had no dealings with Samaritans. And Jesus answered her, if you knew the gift of God, and who it is that is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water.
Okay, so here Jesus is at the well. A woman comes up, so here's this pious Jew in a foreign land. Samaria, no doubt, are at the worst place, right, where those, the hated people from the north are, the Samaritans. Here Jesus is at this well in a foreign land. Here comes a woman, what should we expect? A marriage proposal. The servant, remember from Isaac and Rebecca, what was the deal that he made with God? If I say what? Give me a drink, right? And what does Jesus say to the woman at the well? But give me a drink. So what he's doing is making this proposal not just to this woman of Samaria, but it's more indicative of she's indicative of all of the Samaritans, making this marriage proposal that the Messiah is coming not just for the 2 tribes to the south, but the reunification of all the 12 tribes, and even beyond that, all of the Gentile world is what the Messiah is coming for, right? This worldwide blessing that was going to come through Abraham, promised so long ago. But Jesus uses those terms as a marriage proposal. She doesn't quite get the answer correctly, right? He says to give me a drink. She misses it, that he's made this proposal. But then what Jesus says is, if you knew the gift of God and who it was saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. So remember what I said was that there was always that tradition in antiquity that the groom always gave the bride a gift. And here's the gift that she had missed, that if only you would have known the gift of God that God is going to give to his bride, you would have asked me for a drink and I would have given you living water. So we'll see in a little while a little bit later how Jesus gives us that living water. Now do you want to read this and Mark 2?
18.
Yep.
Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and the people came and said to him, why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus said to them, can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in those days. So here Jesus comes right out and identifies himself as the bridegroom.
So the point from the very bottom, it's at the Last Supper that Jesus provides that messianic wine that he promises that he would give in that hour from the wedding feast at Cana, that my hour hasn't come, but there is an hour when I will come, or I will give you that messianic wine, and he does it in the upper room. But then ultimately he consummates the marriage on the cross with that final cup. Remember when we talked about the Seder meal, and he wasn't going to drink from that cup again until he was in God's kingdom? Didn't complete the Seder meal by drinking of that 4th cup until he's on the cross. He finally takes the wine and drinks it right before he says it is finished. And remember what the wine that was celebrated, what that last cup is from the Seder meal?
4th cup.
Yeah, the fourth cup, right? But what is it? So the third cup is a cup of blessing. But does anybody remember what the fourth cup was? The cup of consummation. So, and what do we typically think of when what gets consummated?
A marriage.
But a marriage, right? So that's what Jesus is doing, is consummating that marriage. We'll put more of that together in a moment. So yeah, can you read this? And so now Jesus is on the cross. While she's looking for it, John 19, starting at 28. One other thing though is that was a tradition at the time of Jesus would have been that the bride on the day of the wedding, he would have worn a crown, maybe a gold crown, maybe from the not the impact, but the influence of the Greek time frame. Think about a crown of foliage, like they maybe think about the Olympics, but just some sort of crown. So if you're at a wedding and here's this big crowd that's gathered, all you had to do is just kind of look up. If you're looking for the groom, look for the one that's wearing the crown.
Right.
Yep.
After this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, said, to fulfill the scripture, I thirst. A bowl full of wine stood there, so they put a sponge full of the wine on hyssop and held it to his mouth. When Jesus had received the wine, he said, it is finished. And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Since it was the day of preparation, in order to prevent the bodies from remaining on the cross on the Sabbath, for the Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. He who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows that he tells the truth, that you may also believe. For these things took place that the scripture might be fulfilled. Not a bone of him shall be broken. And again another scripture that says, they shall look upon him whom they have pierced.
So, this is a marital scene, or first an engagement proposal. And what I mean by that is you think about the terms that the servant used, or that Jesus does at the woman at the well, is give me a drink. What does Jesus say right before he dies on the cross that Ann just read? I'm thirsty, right? And what does that have echoes of? Right? Give me a drink. So he's on the cross. Here's the marriage proposal that I make to my bride, right? Which is all of us, or the church. So he makes that marriage proposal. He's on the cross. It's the groom that wears the crown. What does he have? What's he wearing on the, right? The crown of thorns. So he's got his crown on. He's made the engagement proposal with I am thirsty, or give me a drink. He takes the drink of the wine. We just talked about that cup of consummation, where now the marriage to his bride has been consummated. But what he promised the woman at the well is, what was the gift that he was going to give to his bride?
Living water.
The living water. The soldier comes over, so the scripture was fulfilled, not a bone would be broken. Instead he takes a spear into his heart, takes it out. We've done this 10 times. And what comes out of his side?
Blood and water.
Blood and water, that flowing water, that blood that the night before that he said, this is the blood that I will give to you, the wine that he changes into his blood. So it's the water and blood of the sacraments. His wife comes alive, taken from his side, just as the first Adam was in a deep sleep. While he slept, woman came out of his side. While Jesus sleeps the sleep of death on the cross, his bride is brought to life and is nourished by that water and blood that are the basis of the sacraments. So that living water that he gives us, and the baptism used for other sacraments, and that blood that comes out of his side, that messianic wine that he promised that he would give all the way back at the wedding feast at Canaan. So this is here. Let me just, I know you guys, well, I'll come back to it. Don't let me forget. So what we want to do now, though, is change direction. So all I tried to do in that last little bit is just to show, one, there was a promise that the people were anticipating that a Messiah was going to come. They needed a Redeemer. When that Redeemer came, he would serve the role as bridegroom. Jesus does that by pouring John the Baptist and others pointing to him that he is the bridegroom that has been promised, and then fulfills the responsibility of the groom on the cross, making a marriage proposal, giving his bride the gift, and all those other things that he'd done during his passion and his death. So that was that part. Set that aside just for a moment. Now what we want to do is look at our modern marriages, where the church looks at marriage as a covenant. It's a sacrament, but it's also a covenant. And I know you guys all know this. When there's a covenant, there's a sign of the covenant. And what's the sign for your marriage covenant?
Rings.
The rings, right? And if there's a covenant, there's always a way to renew the terms of the covenant, the oaths that we take, or the vows, right? The first time we're on the altar, we're taking those vows of for better, for worse, until death do us part. So we do that the first time, but with it being a covenant, just like the covenant with God, there's a way to renew those covenant vows. And what's the way that we renew the covenant vows in a marriage?
With a priest and renew.
Not the renewal. Looking for something else. Anybody? Those that have been here before, what am I looking for? Okay.
First round, huh?
No, it's just okay. Roger and Linda are going to be back for a third
Consummate the
time.
marriage, maybe?
Yeah, so through that marital embrace, right? The one flesh union from the very beginning, right? So the very first time we consummate the marriage to the one flesh union, but every time that you participate in that one flesh union, it's a renewal of those oaths, those promises that you took at your wedding day, at that covenant time. There isn't a time that it's more easy to say, I would say yes all over again. So it's through that one flesh union that we renew the sacrament of marriage. So what's the number one goal though for marriage? To get to heaven, right? How do we know that? The Bible tells us. So what Ann is going to read, what Ann's going to read right now is how we get that, or specifically we're going to start with what's the role of the groom in this marital relationship.
This starts at 25, right?
Yep.
Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. Even so, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no man ever hates his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a great mystery, and I mean in reference to Christ and the church.
Okay, I'll start at the end of that. Where have we heard that? Where's that from? Those lines that's underlined behind me. It's from Genesis 2, right? So what Paul does is takes us right back to Genesis 2. That scene when woman is presented to Adam. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two become one flesh. So, hearkening back to that one flesh union. However, what Paul says next is, this is a great mystery, this one flesh union, but what I'm talking about as it applies to Christ and his church. So, who is Christ's church, or what makes up Christ's church?
We do.
All of us, right? So, what he's saying is that there's this mystery of this one flesh union, and what the mystery is of how Christ and all of us participate in that one flesh union. Okay? So keep that in mind. We'll unpack that in a minute. Let me go back to the beginning though. How are husbands supposed to love your wives? But just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So what are we supposed to do for our wives? Lay down our lives, right? For just like Christ did. And not only that, but we lay our lives down for her and keeping her holy. So to present her without splendor, spot, or wrinkle at the end of her life. So that's the responsibility of the husband to the wife, is to lay down our life and to make sure that our wives get to heaven. So now what's the responsibility of the bride to her husband? best line in the Bible by far. Ephesians 5:22.
Wives, be submissive to your husbands as to the Lord.
Okay, hold on. Hold on before you storm the stage. Don't allow, sometimes we allow modern language to get in the way of our understanding. St. Paul was a well-educated Roman. And he was well-educated in Roman military terms. Unfortunately, Ephesians 5 comes before Ephesians 6. But if you remember reading in Ephesians 6, is all about when Paul says, you got to see the battle that's really going on. This battle isn't about bodies or your human life. This is all about your soul and the spiritual battle that's going on. So if you want to be successful against the evil one, you got to put on the helmet of the God, his breastplate. Remember, there's the 7 different pieces of armor. So Paul uses military terms a lot of times to describe things, and he's doing the same thing here with that line of be submissive to your husbands as to the Lord. So let's break down though what submissive means, as Paul is using it as a military term. So if we look at the Hebrew, or not the Hebrew, but the Greek root of that word submission, the first part of it is sub, which means under, right? That makes sense. Submarine, other things, which is under. But missive, that term would have been missio, and what missio means is to be on the same mission. So again, as Paul talking to the Ephesians, using a lot of military terms, he's saying to be under the same mission. So as the general leads the field into a battle, everybody better be, if you want to be successful in this battle, you all better be under the same mission or the same thought as the general that's leading you into battle. So be on that same page, or be under the same thought, be submissive. And so what's the goal of the husband to the wife, or what's the goal, I guess?
To lay down his life.
To lay down his life in all, what else? To get her to heaven. So if you're on that same mission, what's the goal of the husband for the wife?
To get married.
The wife to the husband.
Yeah.
Yes.
What's her goal?
Get to heaven.
To get her to heaven, right?
Him.
So, to get him to heaven. I'll get it right before I'm done. You guys made me nervous when you started to stand up when Ann read that about being submissive. But that's what Paul, though, is just trying to say is, right? Men, you need to lead your wives, lay your life down for her to get her to heaven. That's your number one goal. And for the bride, that's the same rule basically for your husband. Is in that same relationship as your goal is to get your husband to heaven. Now, not to water down though Paul's message, sometimes we should be submissive to one another, but it's probably easy to do when you know what the goal is for one another, for each other. They tell us, guys, right, treat your wife like a queen, and she's going to treat you like a king, and I'm sure it's vice versa, the same way if you put it the other way. So the number one goal for marriage is to get each other to heaven. If the sacramental bond is a covenant bond, right? We talked about this. There's always a way, there's a sign, there's always a way to renew the covenant. But when we participate in that one flesh union, what are the 2 greatest benefits of that marital embrace?
Being one.
Being one, right? It's unitive, right? You're never closer to each other than when the 2 flesh become one. And then what's the other one?
Children.
Right, it's procreative, right? When you come together and love each other in that one flesh union, sometimes 9 months later we need to give that love a new name. So now that's our modern marriage in a nutshell, but what I want to do is just lay down the groundwork for, let's look at what marriage looked like in antiquity. So let's say that it was in Jesus' time. We'll use Mary and Joseph as the prime example. At that time, marriages were arranged, not like what you might typically think of where just a father found somebody and forced a daughter to marry somebody she doesn't know, or vice versa. It was arranged but with permission. So Joseph's father would have seen something between Joseph and Mary. He would have went to Joseph and said, what do you think about a marriage? Joseph would have given his permission. Joseph's father would have went to Mary's father and said, hey, what do you think about a marriage? Mary's father would have went to Mary to say, what do you think about this marriage? and once they had their permission, then the two families would have met, sat down and had a meal, and they would have established they would establish the bride price. Remember some of the stories that we looked at from the Old Testament with the bride price. Laban had Jacob worked for Rachel for 7 years, and then another 7 years, and there was other times when bride prices were established. Want to clarify too with the bride price, when you're talking about Israel, God's chosen people living under a covenant, don't think that a bride price was set only because they looked at in antiquity, they looked at their daughters as property was the only value that they had. It was more of, if you're going to enter into this family relationship that is built around a covenant, you're going to show some dedication to this covenant, because what you're entering into is something for life, so it shows your commitment to that family covenant. So a bride price would have been set. They had this meal, ate, drank, and the marriage would have been legal, but they hadn't consummated the marriage yet, and what they would have been is betrothed. So that's why when we read in Luke, the infancy narrative, is there references of Mary and Joseph being betrothed to each other. They would have been legally wed, but had not come together in that one flesh union. As a side note, because they never did. But just wanted to identify that as being betrothed, right? So that time of what we look at as engagement was just a little bit different. It was formal. You were officially married. But what happened is that the groom would have went back with his parents to their place. They would have separated from the bride. She would have went back to where she was living, and that's when the groom would have prepared a place for his bride, whatever that might be. Building a house, repairing a house, adding to the livestock, whatever the father deemed necessary to go and claim his bride and bring her back to have this new life within their family. So the groom would have went and did what he thought that he needed to do to claim his bride. The groom would have went to his father and said, I've done all these things, look for his permission to go and fetch his bride. And either the father said, yes, you're good to go, or you need to do this, this, and this. He would have done those additional things, went back and asked the father for permission. When the father finally gives permission, though, or before we do that, the bride doesn't know when her groom is coming to claim her. So she's getting ready, right, for her wedding day. She doesn't know when this festival is going to be, but she doesn't want to be blindsided by it, so she's getting ready, preparing herself. She's, probably making sure that her hair is always cut, bathing, whatever she needs to do to get ready for the big day. But you think about that, that story of where things are at, it should make more sense of some of those parables or stories that we hear in the New Testament. We're talking about the bridesmaids and being prepared even through the night, because you don't know when the groom is coming. This is so far what weddings were like in antiquity, again, because you didn't know when the groom was coming to claim his bride. Same thing with John the Baptist, where he was using that analogy with the groom, or not the groom, but the best man had to get the wedding party, everything all set up, not knowing when the groom was coming. He's looking forward to a party. He would finally celebrate when he heard the voice of the groom, because he knew he was coming to claim his bride. So finally the groom goes to the father, asks permission to go and claim his bride. The father does. Here the groom now comes to town. He claims his bride, but the first thing that they do is that the hall is all set up and decorated and ready to go, because the people have been planning for this wedding. But before the party starts, though, the two of them enter into the wedding tent. And for the first time, they consummate the marriage to that one flesh union, where the husband, in all of his strength, offers up his body to his bride. His bride opens and willingly accepts her husband, and the two of them become one flesh for that first time, and the marriage is consummated. They emerge from that wedding tent, and the people celebrate, because now for the next 7 days they get to party to celebrate the wedding. So that's marriage in antiquity. So now let's look at how do we participate though. So again, the end of the book of Revelation is blessed is he who is invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. So we've looked and we understand how we participate in that meal in the Eucharist, but how do we participate in this marriage with God himself? So first thing you got to do is that you got to set a bride price. And what did Jesus give up? What was the price that he gave for his bride? But his life, right? We talked about Jesus on the cross where he makes that marriage proposal by saying, I thirst. He drinks the wine of consummation, gives the gift to his bride, right? That flowing water that he had promised. But before that, and we read this a couple weeks ago, but from John 14, don't let your hearts be troubled. I'm going to, in my Father's house, or only dwelling in places that were not so. But I told you that I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself. So hopefully now you can hear all of that marital type language. This, I'm going to prepare a place for you, but a promise of a return. That's when his disciples asked, when he coming back? And it's Jesus' response was, only my Father knows. So if Jesus is the groom and we're his bride waiting for that return, well, we don't know when he's coming, but we're getting ourselves ready spiritually for him to come. How do we do that? How do we prepare ourselves for that second coming of when Jesus comes for us as the bridegroom? Confession, right? The sacrament of reconciliation. So now we've prepared ourselves for the groom to come and claim us. And when is there a time when Jesus is present to us? When is he truly present to us? In the Eucharist, right? So this wedding analogy continues. So think about it every time that now we're at Mass. Let me go step on a quick tangent though. Think about just at a wedding. Here the bride is, right? She processes down the aisle. Everybody turns to look at the beautiful bride, and she's walking because who's standing at the altar waiting to greet her? But right, the groom is. And so when we participate in the sacrament of the Eucharist, it's our wedding day. So we process down the aisle. An analogy though to the bride though, what she's showing is that, and what she's saying by walking down the aisle too, is that I'm turning my back on an old way of life. Not that there might not be anything wrong with that old way, but her former way, because she's going to this new way of life. So when we walk down that aisle as in that role of the bride, we're leaving our old way behind because we're going to receive in the sacrament, right, that healing that we need to participate in a new life, and not just a new life, but receiving the sacrament, that promise of eternal life. So we process down the aisle in a true wedding. Luckily, there's only one bride. Unfortunately, when we walk down the aisle, there's 40 other brides that are walking. But just kind of keep that in mind, though, as a bride, because now we walk up, and there's something special about our Catholic art and architecture. And it's just a reminder when we come to the front, and there's our groom, we're held up by the communion rail. And that communion rail is just, we talked about this last couple of weeks, right, where there's what we believe that's happening at the Mass. On the altar is that heavenly liturgy going on, so it's actually heaven that's there. As we process down to meet our groom, we're held up by that communion rail, and that communion rail is just a physical border to remind us that this is as close as we're going to get to that heavenly reality until we get to the other side. But fortunately, as we go down there, we meet our groom, and our groom, Jesus himself, reaches across that veil, right from heaven to earth. And as the groom greeting his bride, he offers up his body to his bride. And as his bride, we open and accept his body that he has offered up to us in the sacrament of Eucharist. So, let me just pause right there. Hopefully all that imagery makes sense. Let me go back to the original. in chapter 2 of Genesis with that one flesh union. Adam and Eve participated in that one flesh union as a liturgical way of giving thanks to God for his creation, for being part of his creation, and also for a celebration of God giving a little bit of his power of creation to humanity through that one flesh union between a man and a woman. When we go to the Mass and the sacrament of Eucharist, is a renewal of the covenant. But every time we renew, or every time that we receive the sacrament, it's a conjugal act of love between Jesus, the groom, and us as his bride. Let me go back to remember what Paul said. This is a great mystery, but what I'm talking about is that one flesh union between Jesus and his church. And so it is a great mystery, but we still get to participate in that one flesh union with our groom, Jesus himself, every time we go to the Eucharist. So again, one thing that's great about our Catholic art and architecture, it stimulates the senses. It's a reminder of where we are, what's happening. Here's a picture of the altar in St. Peter's Basilica. Has anybody been to St. Peter's? Mm-hmm. I can't imagine. What's it like?
Big.
Yeah, but it's just got to be
It's gorgeous.
stimulating,
Yeah.
overwhelming, right?
Yeah, it is.
So,
And they'll put for different churches, like say New York's church, where that comes in the basilica.
On the floor.
On the floor, so you can,
oh yeah,
they'll
yeah.
have marks so you can kind of see how compared to other churches.
Right.
You know.
Oh, that's cool.
So this is a picture of the altar at St. Peter's. What's over the altar is what's called the baldacchino. And baldacchino is just a fancy name for a canopy. And if we were to take a canopy and you put canvas sides on all four sides, now what do you have? Is a tent. So what the baldacchino, though, is a reminder of us of where we're at every time we go to Mass. We're not just at Mass, not just to receive Eucharist, but this is our wedding day. Because in that marriage tent at the altar is our groom, and he's not preparing a place for us, he's preparing his very body for us to receive in the sacrament. The Basilica down at Notre Dame, just down in South Bend, they have the same, they've used fabric as their baldacchino, much more subtle than at St. Peter's Basilica, but still trying to remind the people of don't forget of what's happening every time we go to Mass, that we are his bride as we receive his body and blood. So now what's our commission? We're at the end of the book of Revelation, almost at the end. There's not many chapters or verses left. Before Ann reads Revelation 22:17, keep in mind John's revelation, what he's seeing is that heavenly liturgy that's going on. It's the high priest, it's the Lamb, it's Jesus himself that is presiding over this heavenly liturgy that's going on around the altar, and there's this great multitude around the altar. And so what did John hear in Revelation 22:17?
The Spirit and the bride say, come. And let him who hears say, come. And let him who is thirsty come. And let him who desires to take the water of life without price.
So let me start with the end of that. Here's the reference to let anyone who wishes to take the water of life as a gift. Here's a gift, again, that water, that flowing water that's promised to all of us, used in baptism to cleanse us of our sins, right, to start the healing for all of us, and it's a gift from God. But let me back up to the beginning. Here the Spirit and the bride say, come. So in this line, who's the Spirit, or who do you think might be the Spirit? God, right? God or Jesus presiding over this heavenly liturgy that's going on. And who's his bride?
The church.
The church, right? So the great multitude, because the church, the body of Christ, is made up of all of us, meaning the church militant, those of us here on earth, and the church triumphant, those that have made it. So this great multitude is standing around, and it's the Spirit and the bride that are all saying, come. And remember that John said, boy, if I only had so much, so a lot of things get shortened up. So what John just gives us here is what he heard, is that it was the invitation, come. to where it was really more than that. It's as these liturgies going on, the invitation is come. It's come here, you've got to see this. This is like, it looks like a heavenly liturgy is going on. It looks like a meal of remembrance. It looks like a Catholic Mass is going on. It looks like there's a wedding that's taking place. And when you see it, it's really all four of those things that are going on all at once every time we go to the Mass. But who is that invitation though? Around the altar is Jesus and this great multitude, but who's the invitation though to come? Everyone, right? But everyone, because is everyone around the altar at this time? Everybody in our family, all of our friends, is everybody around the altar?
No.
So what we're to do though is now is to invite other people. If you got to come and see this. So Ann and I are coming. Hold on, I've only got about 20 minutes left of our time together. Now that commission goes to you is what are you going to do to share what we've discovered in our time together as you go forward. Maybe you want to come back again. Maybe there's other people you want to invite here. Just what are you going to do to share with others what's been revealed to you here? Now I just want to make a challenge to everybody. If you remember the story of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar is the king in Jerusalem right before who came to town? Babylon comes to town. They killed his sons right in front of him, so that was the last thing he saw. They plucked his eyes out, blindfolded him, and carried him away into exile. Nebuchadnezzar, yeah, terrible story for Nebuchadnezzar, but Nebuchadnezzar was more indicative of all of Israel. They had become blinded to God's ways. They had turned their back on their on God, the one true God, on their Maker, on their husband. And it wasn't until the coming of Jesus that all things were revealed, that the people were allowed to see, not only see God, right, the incarnate God, but to see His ways and what He had in mind for them. So what we typically say a lot is, I'll believe it when I see it. What I want to say to you, though, the challenge is that you'll see it when you start believing it, or be living it. So the last 5 weeks dumped a whole lot on you. Maybe some of you are like, whatever, you didn't tell me anything I didn't already know. But if we go back 4 or 5 weeks, so even just the receipt of communion, that ordinary bread and wine do become His body and blood. When we're at the Mass, we participate in that heavenly liturgy. Somehow we're taken up to heaven, or heaven comes down to us when we celebrate Mass, or even tonight with that relationship, that marital relationship that God desires for us, that He really desired from the very beginning when He first made man. So, a lot of that might be a whole lot. I want to see it, but I just say we'll see it when we start to believe it. And believe it means be living it. So, just the challenge is what we talked about a few weeks ago is how to prepare for Mass, and it's observing the Friday fast, going to confession for the forgiveness of mortal sin, that fasting from midnight before Mass until you receive communion. And then if you're not, I don't want to say buying it, but you're not even understanding it, but tonight what we talked about was every time we go to Mass, it's just like it's like a wedding day. Either our first wedding or a renewal of our wedding vows. And if it was your wedding, would you ever just stop weeding in the garden and get in the car and go right to your wedding? No, you spend a whole lot of time, right, getting ready, getting dressed up. And I'm not sure if we do that anymore as a representative to everybody else of what's going on. So maybe just think about how we dress when we go to Mass. Oh, yeah, Ann did a thing, so I wouldn't forget. So we started out we started out with the question of, is there any hope? And you bet that there's hope, right? What God had intended from the very beginning, the relationship that He wanted to have with His creation, that covenant relationship, even though we know the story of original sin, but now God comes to us in an intimate way. He gives us that opportunity to participate in that intimate union that He wants to have with us, as intimate as a husband and wife, and that's participating in His sacraments. specifically in the holiest of holy sacraments, which is the Eucharist. And I think we're at the end. Is there anything else before we get to, what time is it? Do I have any time left?
Not much, no.
Oh.
There was one slide that you said you were gonna go back to, and I was curious about it. The
The
slide
two
with
trees.
trees on it.
Yeah, yep. And so I just think that everybody maybe knows that, right? The central drama of the story is all about these two trees that were identified in the first two chapters of Genesis: the tree of knowledge and the tree of the tree of life. Adam goes to that tree of knowledge, and in his disobedience brought about all the discord. With Jesus going to that tree of life and his perfect obedience, he's able to open up those gates to heaven, and we see what heaven is like and what has happened to that tree of life, which before his wedding day or his time on the cross, it was just two timbers tied together. Now what we see in heaven is that tree of life is teeming with fruit and leaves for the medicine of his people. And now we get to eat of that fruit of the tree of life. So if I may, there's just two things. All right, so we're all done, okay? I guess let me ask you, any questions or feedback?
Yeah, I do have a question. You're talking about the marriage and marriage being man and woman. If man and woman go up to heaven, are they going to know each other? I mean, I'm just curious. I mean, you know, are they going to know who they were married to?
Sure, but think about the story. At one point, the Pharisees, or some of them, came to Jesus and tried to, not to trick him, but were like, here was the rules at the time of Jesus. If a husband died and left his young bride, it was the responsibility of one of his brothers to marry her. So they're trying to trap Jesus, and they're like, when they go to heaven, if somebody dies, his brother marries the wife. If that brother dies, the next son takes her as his wife. When they get to heaven, whose wife is she going to be? And that's when Jesus says, in heaven, we're not going to give each other as husband and wife. Our marriage relationship, again, back to our very first night together, we said is a reflection of who God is, the Trinity, and the relationship that God wants to have with us. He tries to reveal that through this life. When we get to heaven and we're in the presence of God, and God is all love, right? All mercy. When we see all of that, right, we're going to be transformed. So yes, I'm sure that our family and our wives are going to be there, but our relationships are going to be totally different.
Right, okay. Makes sense.
Pure back to that time of, think about what Adam and Eve had before the fall.
Right.
They were naked and yet knew no shame.
Right.
So in front of God, they had this totally different relationship that we can't quite appreciate this side of heaven.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Anything else? Make a little bit of sense? Okay, so now that though has to be the official line of, because what Ann and I have tried to do, and I know we've told you the Father Eric story before, we try to keep it all to where it's all part of the catechism, but we just have two additional things we want you to just to consider, thinking about the last 5 weeks that we've been together. And that first one is, or let me just lay the groundwork with, who knows what our posture is when we go into adoration, or if we go into the church sometime and the monstrance is exposed on the altar. What's our posture when we come in or before we go into the pew? Down on 2 knees and you bow. Why is that? Any idea? Out of respect, reverence, right? Jesus is present, right? So down, not, normally when we go into the Mass, right, still as a sign of reverence, we go down on a knee, but boy, when that monstrance is there and he's present, it's down on 2 knees and you bow. Set that aside for a second. Think about when we talked about the Ark of the Covenant. What was the unfortunate lesson that Uzzah learned about the Ark?
Don't touch it.
Don't touch, right? Here's the power of God, and sometimes it's a vengeful God, but just some things of God just take and needs our reverence and our respect. So now from the last couple of weeks, what we talked about is every time we go to Mass, it's like going to heaven. The priest is there in persona Christi. It's our wedding day, right? And he's offering up his body to us. So what I want you just to consider is how we receive communion. Let me start over, or let me just say this too. The U.S. Catholic bishops allow the receipt of communion in 2 different ways, totally valid. On your hand or on the tongue. It's totally okay doing it either way, allowed by the church. All that I'm just asking you to consider is when you think about what's happening at that point, who we're approaching, right? In the sacrament, in the Eucharist, it's not just Father, right? Father's standing there in persona Christi. So it's Jesus himself offering his body. We should, or I just want you to consider receiving on the tongue. Don't get your hands in the way. Think about the one flesh union. You wouldn't do that. So Jesus wants to feed us that bread of life. Let me give you another little analogy too. Think about Adam and Eve, and when they went to the tree and were disobedient, what did they do for the fruit? Right? They reached out and grabbed their fruit and took it themselves. Now that bread of life, though, it's Jesus that wants to feed us that bread of life, to where allow him to come and feed us. So
Is that why us Eucharistic ministers that we wash our hands after we're completed? Is that why we do that?
Before?
After.
Okay.
After we're done, we go up to the altar and dip our hands
Yeah,
in
your finger
water
into the water.
clean up.
right.
I guess
Probably it's just would be unfortunate though if it is what we truly believe is body, blood, soul, and divinity is in the Eucharist.
yeah.
Just to wash him away
But I don't
like that. I don't either,
It's still
Roger.
a little thing that they actually, it's a little dish and then they dispose
Okay.
it in the.
Yeah, so that is
It's
okay.
really small.
So a thing of reverence, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So not walking little pieces that are.
Right.
Yes.
And you
Yeah.
also bow after you
Yeah.
leave there.
And I don't know if anybody knows, but that sacristy sink, that only goes into the ground. It doesn't go like to the public system. So that his body and blood never leaves the church. So just as a quick tangent. So I don't know if there's any other thoughts of that or just something to consider. So one other thing though, I said 2 things. One other thing is when we go to church though, we take the role of the bride on, right? But in mine and Ann's marriage, we have our role of groom and bride. But when we go to Mass though, we're his bride. And there used to be a time in the 50s when, I think the 50s, when most women wore their veils to Mass. And does anybody know what it might say in the, not the encyclopedia, but in the catechism in the 50s, why did women veil?
60s too.
In the 60s. But does anybody just know what it might have said? Why was the reason a woman veiled? To show that she was under the protection of her husband, is why you wore a veil. Now comes a secular campaign, right, in the 60s and 70s, about husbands and what husbands were like. Back to, right, even John saying, Paul being submissive to your husband. Some women might think, submissive to my husband? I married Homer Simpson. I married Al Bundy. That guy's a buffoon. I'm not going to be submissive to him. But there was probably a time too, in that time, whenever that started, the 60s and 70s, of women wearing veils because they're under the protection of their husband. And I think it might have been a misunderstanding when we threw our veils down and said, again, he's kind of a buffoon. I'm not under his protection. I'm strong. Don't need him. When Ann and I go to Mass, my responsibility when I'm at home, right, is that to get her to heaven, to escort her on my arm to the on her judgment day, But when we enter into the church, Anne slips off of my arm as her groom, and we take on a different role. Once we're at Mass, who's her groom?
Jesus.
Jesus. And I think that's what was intended when women wear veils to church, is because I'm under my husband's protection at Mass. And who's her husband? Jesus, right? And we threw those veils down and said we're not under my husband's protection anymore. She wasn't revolting against me, you know, she were revolting maybe against God and taking our veils off. So it's beautiful how the church, St. John Paul II, revealed all this with the marital imagery, and it's beautiful. I just think that it's unfortunate that we've lost that that tradition, because again, there's something special about our Catholic art and architecture that gets us into the scene, stimulates our senses, and reminds us of what's going on at the Mass.
But then sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but then isn't the man also, when he walks in the church, he's the bride also? So how come he doesn't have to?
He is the bride. Yes, he is also the bride.
Everybody asks that.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Everybody asks that.
Yeah, so what is the?
Okay, so there still though is a difference, right? God made them male and female, so we still have our genders of male and female, right? So keep that in mind. Well, no, I'll keep going. With Adam and Eve, right? They come together, that one flesh union. I'm going to back up even farther. Before there was woman, Adam is made first. Adam is awesome because he's made first, and he's given dominion of all things, all the animals. Hold on. He's in charge, right? But it wasn't good that he should be alone. That's when he made a suitable partner for him, and the two came together in one flesh, and creation comes forth from that relationship. But you got to think about the participation in that relationship. God gives a little bit of His power of creation to in that one flesh union, but it's not an equal participation. Men, we only have a small part in it, but who ultimately incubates, nurtures that life for 9 months?
The wife.
Is women do, right? And then in the history of the church, we veil that which is sacred. There was a veil that was put on, not the holiest of holies. There was a big veil over that place, but over the ark is veiled. The altar during the Mass is veiled. So we veil that which is holy, and we veil our women, because what makes women sacred? What makes them special? Creation, their ability to create. So Adam is awesome because he was the first one and had dominion, but the crown jewel of God's creation is woman. Life comes forth from women, so that's why women are veiled, because they are sacred, and they're sacred because of their womb. So, to answer your question though, I just think that it would confuse people though. We still have our different genders. And to see a man come in, right, with a veil on, just wouldn't be right. So,
Especially in West Area.
so hopefully though that answers your question of.
You did a good job.
Okay. And do you have any editorial to add to that? You're better at that than I am.
No, I usually just shiver his ear on the way home. So nothing. I just think I guess to reiterate what he's saying is those last couple of things he wanted to talk on. It's just a few things that we always talk about how why is it that today they say that even of people who go to Mass regularly, there's only half of the people believe that that God is truly present, body, blood, soul, and divinity. People still will go up there thinking it's just a symbol. And what happened? Why did that happen? And so we're always kind of talking about those things, and we think a lot of it is some of the traditions that have been lost over the years. Again, it seems so weird. Again, I don't wear a veil, but maybe because I feel like people would look at me like, why are you wearing a veil, right? But when you understand why veils were worn, I go, I should totally put a veil on, because it's just a reminder to people, of what you're doing. Why do we want to go see St. Peter's Basilica? Why do we love it when you go someplace you see some gorgeous, beautiful old church? not because it's sterile, but because it's got stained glass windows and statues and
Stimulating.
grottos and stimulating things. And when you have those reminders when you go to mass of veils and communion rails and receiving on the tongue and different things like that, it just further helps people see the sacredness of what's going on when you're in a more sparse church and you are everybody's kind of lackadaisical, whatever, lackadaisical, thank you, about it all. You can see where people lose that reverence to what's going on, I guess. So he was, in bringing up those last couple of things, that's just kind of our, like I said, our little commentary on when we have a lot of discussions about what do you do to get people to believe it again. And I do think that with a younger generation of people, I think like the 20-something age group, a lot of them are really being drawn to like the Latin Mass or to churches where they do that. And I have most of the people that I know that veil regularly are all 20-something women who have young children. So it's just interesting. But again, because I think everybody's searching for that and everything that we can do to help people learn all that. That's kind of our goal, is to just kind of bring people back to that.
I mean, I personally, when I made my first communion, we knelt down at the communion rail and we did receive on the tongue. And I really, even to this day, I miss kneeling down at the communion rail.
Right?
Yeah.
I do. I mean, I think about it pretty much every Sunday. I have for years. It's like, it made you feel more reverent.
Yes. Yep.
Was that a Vatican II?
Yeah,
Change?
it was Vatican II
Yeah.
and it changed.
It does seem much more natural to kneel. Like there's a church in Grand Rapids, Sacred Heart in Grand Rapids has the communion rail, and that's just how every mass goes. They go up and you go to the communion rail, and I'm like, oh, it's so lovely to go there. Because it's just so natural. Have you been to that one? Yes. I'm like, it's and it moves along just as quickly. If not, you know what I mean? It does, and it just seems so much more natural to be on your knees and to receive like that.
Well,
But,
going back to the veil, a couple I've seen in West Australia, people wearing them.
yeah. I mean, there's a handful of them too
I
that
just
do it.
didn't understand.
Are there?
Yes.
Yeah.
There's
Oh,
couple cute little women, and there's Heidi May's daughter, and a couple. There's like,
I think Hannah and Andrew Martina.
yeah.
So-
Yes.
Just anything else? And keep in mind though, those last two things too were post Omega. So no telling Father Eric that we said only receive on the tongue, kneeling down, and women have to start wearing a veil. So he very nicely asked us a year ago of, I'm busy, I don't have time to clean up the glass, the broken glass behind
So I think
Okay.
that's kind of it.
Yep, that's it. Again, we thank everybody for your time.
Thank you.
We love coming over.
Yes.
We hope Vicky gives us another opportunity to come over. If you guys know anybody that might be interested, to let Vicky know. Or again, there's always people that come back for a second time if you hear about it and want to come back again.
I don't
So,
think it'll ever get boring.
right. Yeah. So, until we meet again, and I hope that it's soon, if we can get one clap for Jesus on 3. 1, 2, 3.
You guys, we're wrapping it up, and I can't believe that we're here. We have a lot that we accomplished, right? Working through these pages, and nobody flies.
Oh, that makes me feel better.
Right? So our hope and our goal is that you're able to share this experience with those around you that you think might benefit by coming here also. And as long as there's interest, Father Eric is supportive of all of this that's happening up here. He is grateful to Mike and Ann for sharing this time with all of us and to walk us through in, if you will, layman's terms, of how to actually be able to read and comprehend and, love this love letter and to understand it better. So please don't let this be the end of your journey, right? Pick it up. These videos are out there for you to review, to go through again. I know that seems like I'm going to do it, right? And then a month goes by and I think I'm going to do it. But just know that if you reach out to us when we advertise this in the bulletin again, if there's interest, we'll run it again. And if you come through it again, that's awesome. And you're going to pick up more pieces. Mike and Ann will share at the beginning that they're going to have this tapestry turned around and it's gonna look like a bunch of strings, you know? And then at the very end, he turns it around, and it's a beautiful picture of our country. So hopefully that's what you've gotten out of these weeks, that you've invested in this time here to be with us. So thank you for that. I will be, some of you turned in your hard copy surveys to me, thank you for that. If not, there's still time, you can drop them in the Dropbox, parish office, or I'll be zipping out to you an electronic one. If you would please fill those out for us, so that we know how we can better serve you, how we can better make this better, and reach more people, whatever it might be. We're looking for your feedback, so thank you for that. Two more things. One is on the table, there is a small gift for you if you would like to take it home with you. This is a window frame for your car, and it's a rosary, and in the middle of it says, "Call your mother." It's just a beautiful reminder when you are driving down the highways of how you can evangelize to others, and hopefully just give them inspiration to pick their rosaries up. Right? It's one of the great gifts of our Catholic faith. And if there's not enough of them, I have more. I just didn't know. Yeah, here's that one, right? Last but not least, super, super grateful, like you say, to Mike and Ann. Has everybody had an opportunity to sign this card?
I didn't sign it. Oh, yes, I did.
Right? This is just a small token of our appreciation for you guys and all the time that you put in for this and the growth that you've helped us. And so thank you from all of us.
Thank you.
Right? And so not to make this night any longer than it was already, because it was fabulous, and I want to stay here with all of you. There's still wine in the box. All the things.
No, not
Some
the
desserts.
driving.
No. So how about we just end in gratitude and thanksgiving for not only Mike and Ann, but for our Lord being so patient with us as we learn and try to understand and draw closer to Him. So let's just end with a Hail Mary and an Our Father, as we pray in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary,
full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.